Hi everybody. So I wanted to make a second video. I don't remember what I'm calling this series. It's like how I got here or something like that. I don't have one of those camera things that holds the camera either. So in the first part, I talked a little bit about kind of why I left the public ministry and all those details, and talked a little bit about my frustration with kind of the way ministry has to be done today, social media mentality, and all of that. And so my intention, of course, in this series is to kind of walk people through a little bit of how I got where I am. And it's not because I have this overwhelming need to do that, but it's because one of the questions I get asked the most. Um, Even people that follow me for the fiction writing are curious often about how about my religious beliefs and spiritual beliefs. And so I get these questions a lot, and it'd be kind of handier for me to be able to go, okay, well these are here on my YouTube channel, so you can go listen to them. So my Christian walk, I am a Christian, and I don't use that terminology identically with a lot of people, but that will become evident. Um, I guess I was raised Southern Baptist somewhat. My parents were Christians, were in the Southern Baptist Church. Although we didn't, we kind of attended church on and off. There were times when we went quite often, and there was times when for years, we wouldn't go. And my parents were Christians, and probably maybe a little bit more knowledgeable about Christianity. So when I was raised, we went to church on occasion. We had Sunday school, vacation Bible school, a few of those things, but never knew anything. We didn't have any type of home worship. Um, it was a culture. We live in a Christian, or we lived in a Christian culture. And I apologize for my allergies. I know my eyes are a little glassy because I've been sneezing and coughing all day. But anyways, I wouldn't say that I would say that I was a cultural Christian, although I didn't have any idea what that meant. And my dad was in the military, so we traveled a lot. And when we moved to Maryland when I was probably 9 or 10 years old. My dad was stationed at Andrews Air Force Base. And of course we were Baptist, but we were completely surrounded mostly by Roman Catholics. And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know the difference between the two. And all of my friends would go certain days, Wednesdays or something, and would go to CCD or something like that. And I would always ask my dad, why don't I get, because they had pizza, and they would tell me they had pizza and stuff. And I always had to go home. All my friends would go, and then I had to go home. And I would ask my dad, why don't I get to go? And he said, because we're not Catholic. And that's all I knew. And I remember one time my baseball coach asking me what my belief system was, and I told him I was a Christian. So that's all I knew. And he asked me, yeah, but what kind? And I didn't have a clue. I didn't know. I would say that I was raised in a system, a theistic system, in that there was prayer, and I was told to say my prayers at night. I believed there was a God, and but like I said, it was a cultural thing. And when I started going to high school, there was a lot of people that were like the evangelical Bible pounders or whatever. And one of them was my friend Chris Awalt, who's my friend now, some of you know, who I wrote the book Wick with. And he was kind of a hardcore evangelical. He was always trying to get me saved, and dragging me to things, youth youth functions and dances and things like that. And at one point, I went to some evangelical deal with Chris, and there was a evangelist or something, and he gave a message, and I just remember him, and I was just trying to be honest, but I remember him asking, do you believe you're a sinner? And I said yes. He may have asked, where do you think you would go if you died? I didn't know. And then he asked, if I wanted to be saved, and it seemed like it was a reasonable thing. In a Christian culture, being a Christian, I think that was something that you do. And so I went forward and prayed with him. It didn't make any impact on my life. I didn't start reading the Bible. I didn't go join a church. Shortly after that, I went to college, and my main deals in college, I bartended a lot, and I also at some point began working in juvenile law enforcement as a detention officer in a probation facility. And there I came into contact with the people that come in to preach to the inmates, and had to set up those things and sit through them as a guard. And again, I didn't get the feeling that there was anything that I needed to know or do, or that I knew there were people that maybe knew a little bit more about the Bible. I didn't know anything about the Bible, but I knew a lot of the stories. I had an aunt and a couple of aunts and my grandmother who spoke in Bible. I mean, they used Bible stories and allusions, and that was curious to me because I didn't know those stories. And but that was kind of the end of my curiosity. And then I met my wife and moved away to Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we started going to a church right about the time my first daughter was born, which was when I would have been about 25. And we basically started going because I didn't want, it was my first child, and I didn't want her to be a criminal. So I thought some type of I had a kind of a moral foundation, whether if it wasn't overtly Christian, it was a moral foundation, and I was surrounded by a Christian culture. So I felt like that was at least important to have some kind of moral foundation. So we started going to church, and I very soon realized that I didn't get the feeling that anybody knew what they were doing, but I knew that I knew less than everybody else. And so I was very uncomfortable. We got into a young married couple's Sunday school class, and we would go to each other's houses and stuff for fellowships. And I never wanted to get asked to pray, or because I just didn't know anything. And I think at that time I just got convicted that I wanted to read the Bible because I thought it was important. It's the foundational document of the religion, and I had accepted it kind of de facto. And so I decided I wanted to read it. And so sometime in there, I started reading the Bible. And like a lot of things, I was always self-educated. I was always, I started reading Solzhenitsyn when I was in college, and Solzhenitsyn was a Christian, and I was impressed by some of the Christian moral teaching from Solzhenitsyn, some of his short stories, and I read some of the Puritan age American literature, and I was always just curious. I was curious the history of it and all. But I had always, even after I left school, I continued to educate myself, and I read pretty strenuously. And I was reading the Bible, and at one point I had gone all the way through the Bible. And so now I had at least, although I didn't understand it, I had a general understanding of what people were saying when they said things, And very soon after that, I realized that maybe 98% of the people around me, if we were at church or in Sunday school, were where I was before I read the Bible. They felt exactly like I felt. They didn't know anything. They didn't really feel like they had a need to know anything, and they were cultural Christians, and that was a real eye opener to me. And at the same time, I've always kind of been a logical person. I had studied logic on my own, and I thought it was strange if it turned out that I was born into the true belief system. It would be somewhat not random, but this time I had no understanding of the sovereignty of God or anything. But what are the chances that you would be born into with all these other religious systems that were contrary to one another? What are the chances? And I'd heard all the arguments because I was a bartender, so I had talked to everybody, and I'd heard all the arguments that all religions worship the same God, and all of the religions, they were all written by men, but there were some grains of truth. And I had atheistic friends. I had read philosophy pretty intensely, and so I had read all of the same books that my atheist friends that brought them to atheism. I'd read those, although it didn't carry me there. And so I just started studying a lot more, and my wife started reading her Bible and studying, and we moved back to Lubbock. We just wanted to be in a smaller town, and we ended up joining the church that my parents had helped start 20 some years earlier, maybe 30 years earlier. And it was kind of a big church at that point, not huge, moderate sized, in Lubbock. And we lived just down the road, maybe a block away. And so we walked to church, and it was good. I thought that our pastor seemed to know more than most people, and I would listen to him in the sermons. And although I did missionary work, went to Mexico a couple of times, and although I sensed contradiction, my mind has always been one that has a huge problem with contradiction. And there were some things that I needed, having read through philosophy, and I read through some of the other holy books, and in a search, there were things that I know that I needed to have satisfied for me to ever feel right. And that is that I dismiss then, and I dismiss now, any concept that we are able to create our own God, or that this is anything other than a fantasy. And I talk to many people who have come to their own spirituality, and I'm not making fun of them. I'm just saying that logically would have never worked for me, because the idea that you can make a God, to me, intrinsically destroys the concept of godhood that I would have to have. And that is that God would have to be omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing, everywhere present. I could not conceive of calling something a God that was ignorant, or that was somehow could be created by men. So I can't go out into the field and get a piece of wood and carve something and call it a God, or even a representative of God, because logically that just doesn't. Why would I ever bow to or worship or see as deity something that I made? And that includes something physically or something spiritually, that I made something up. So I didn't. I immediately rejected the idea that if there was a true God, that true God could be made by men. He couldn't be God if he'd been made by men. I dismissed the idea that all religions were trying to define the same God, because they were internally contradictory. And so a thing cannot be itself and not itself. It cannot be itself and its opposite. And so logic precluded that idea. I dismissed the idea that the Holy Scriptures. In other words, I put this a better way. I came to the conclusion, even after I had read the Bible, but not knowing, I didn't understand it the first time through or second time through. I came to the conclusion that I had to accept it or reject it solely based on internal evidence, not on my own feelings, my own opinions. But I read skeptical books, I read skeptics, I read people that challenged the authority of the Scriptures. Honestly, I wanted to be right. I wanted to find truth, and I found that I had to either accept the Scriptures as divinely inspired and non-contradictory, or there was the other solution to me was that they had to be dismissed, because even if there was a serious systemic error in the Scriptures somewhere, then why would I believe any of it? I mean, if I believed that they could be an error. And so I was in a conundrum because I didn't understand them, and there seemed to be some implied differences. I couldn't call them contradictions because there's a law of non-contradiction that didn't apply. But I was in a conundrum because I knew at some point I was going to have to accept the Scriptures and accept all of it through study, through examination of each contradiction and a harmony of the entirety of the Bible, or I was going to have to consider something else. I would have to come another conclusion, even the eventual conclusion, perhaps, that there is a God and God is unknowable, which was there was at least a logical train that could get me to that place. And so, and during the meantime, I'm reading a lot of I read the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I read Muslim writings, Sufi writings. I read, became a big fan of Malcolm X, Nation of Islam. I just Buddhism, Mormonism, and I knew people that were of these different faiths, and I just had to do my own study. And so that's kind of where I was, and I was studying a lot, and we had moved back to Lubbock, and at that time, I really got into studying the Bible, and I was having problems because I was finding things in the Scriptures that were either contradictory or that were challenging to the worldview and the system that I was in, the church that I went to. But I didn't know how to describe these things. And one of the things that I now know what it is, but I did not know at the time, was the overall sovereignty of God. And so, I as I mentioned, I went through the Scriptures again, this time with the view of harmonizing all of the elements that seemed to be contradictory. And if I couldn't do so, then I was going to have to give up. And so I read through all the atheistic challenges and things that people bring up about what were challenges. This couldn't have happened because these two people have a different story, or these seem, and was able to dismiss them one at a time until I came to the conclusion that the Bible was not contradictory, internally contradictory. And at the same time, there were elements that of the way we practiced Christianity that I had difficulties with, and the main thing came down to the fact that the Scriptures to me portrayed an absolute sovereign God, a good, benevolent, but sovereign God, and the God we seem to preach in the Southern Baptist Church, that and every experience I had with mainstream Christianity, what seemed to be a reactor. In other words, that he had kind of, in this Gnostic way, created the world and put everything in motion, and then, oh no, man broke it. what are we going to do? Okay, well let's do this. We'll fix it. And so God seemed to be reacting to man, fixing things that were broken, angry, lashing out, and the next minute doing this, and this contradicted the concept I had of deity. And this was what was being taught by the church. The concept that I had of deity and what I had determined from the scripture was that God is the actor. He's the prime mover and the prime actor. And that although communicating to man in time in ways that seem to indicate changes of mood, attitude, knowledge, or understanding, but that those things were just a way of communicating to man, 3D man, moving through time in the way that we could understand it. But that my understanding of God from the scriptures is that God is the prime actor, and that he's not fixing anything that was broken. He's acting in time. And this was all for a purpose. And so at some point in there, I really kind of grew very skeptical of the faith system that I was in, and I started watching online, watching TV, watching Trinity Broadcasting and reading books, and got involved with Promise Keepers, and all of this stuff just failed for me. and there was this very, very serious disconnect that I had that I couldn't identify. At the time, I had gone to work for a digital products company that we sold office products and hospital equipment and that sort of thing. And we had I was a salesman, and we had another salesman that was working there that was just a horrible salesman. He was one of I don't even remember his name, but he was a horrible salesman. And he one day we got talking, and he asked me a couple of questions about our church and what we teach and all that. And he said, well, I've got this book I'd like to give you. Maybe it'll help you out. And the book was The Sovereignty of God by A.W. Pink. And one day, he brought the book to me and gave it to me and said, you can have it, you can keep this copy. And I think a couple of days later, he was fired. He was really, really a bad salesman. And so I had this book, and next to my bed, I would have, a pile of 20 books that I was constantly reading. And I took this book and threw it on the pile, and it eventually got buried. And at the same time, I kind of became more aware of things that were going on in the world. Kind of unsteadiness. This was way pre-Y. We hadn't even heard of Y2K. And I was asked to teach in my Sunday school class, which was very problematic because I didn't know how to teach. I had never taught before. And so a lot of things were happening to me. And one of our associate pastors came up to me and said, hey, I know that you're interested in world events and things like that. And I was reading a lot of prophecy and got entangled in some futurism and that sort of thing. And he said, we want to put together this thing called a Worldview Weekend where we bring in these people who are experts on Christian worldview and all of this thing, and we'd like you to be a part of the committee that's bringing them in. And it's the city that was bringing them in, so it was like a bunch of churches from around the city. And so at the first meeting, I met some men from different churches, and we got talking afterwards, and it turned out that they, even though they were all going to different churches, had a parachurch organization, a group called A Warehouse, where they were teaching. There was the first hour would be like a reading of the news, what's going on in the news and the worldview and all those things. And the second hour would be, some type of Bible teaching. And so I started going to that, and I really, really appreciated it because to me it was more examinatory of life and living, of what we were really supposed to be living like. And I felt like the church situation was really kind of dead and moribund, maybe I guess is the word, and that this group, A Warehouse, was really more along the lines of where I needed to be. And so I started really getting into that. I started taking my wife, and we would have guest speakers came in, and we had people that came in and talked about, the people that modern Christian Zionists would come in and talk about Israel and the feast and all those things. And we had all these different speakers that came in. Some of them were just nuts and crazy, and obviously crazy. A lot of people in the group were obviously crazy, but it did allow me to stretch a little bit in my intellectual understanding of people and to see ways that different people interacted with faith and those type of things. And so one night I was lying in bed and I had been reading, and I reached over. I may have woken up in the middle of the night. I don't remember. I reached over and I was going through my pile of books, and I found that book, The Sovereignty of God by A.W. Pink. And I started reading it, and almost from page one, what I immediately discovered was that I had found a kindred spirit, in that the writing was brutally honest, and that it was not subject to some type of denominational dogma. And basically, he went immediately to the point of what was wrong with Christianity and where they had apostatized, where they had gone away from the truth. And he did one thing that I had never seen in all the Christian books I had read and all the sermons, is that he insisted on the authority of the scriptures. And he harmonized. So normally what would happen is someone says, oh, this is true, and they're never challenged. And there's if there's other scriptures that on their face contradict what they're saying, they just didn't deal with those. I talked about this in the first video. They didn't seem to know those, or they didn't seem to address those. And one thing about A.W. Pink is he immediately went to every objection and pounded that objection into oblivion. Even objections that I had, even objections that I came up with. And so and I remember waking up my wife constantly and saying, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the solution to bring everything together. And it changed my prayer life. It changed everything for me. And so I started really studying more than I'd ever studied before. I studied everything. I studied church history. I studied different doctrines. I studied, as I showed last time, Arminianism. I studied Calvinism. I studied the history of the early church. I studied all the major heretical sects. And it slowly dawned on me that we were living in the land of the blind, and that nobody knew what they were talking about. And not that I did, but at least I had submitted myself now to a system that required a external authority, meaning the scriptures as the final authority, that there could be no contradiction within the belief system, and it explained everything that I could see in the world, and it explained everything that I could see in human behavior, the nature of man, our sinfulness, our total depravity. It explained God's interaction with man, why weird things happen in the scripture. Why did God destroy this people and he saved this people? Why did he pick this person randomly, seemingly randomly? Why did Jesus pass all kinds of sick and hungry people and not even deal with them, just to heal this one guy that was in this house, and then left? Why was it explains so much about the scriptures, and it also put the lie on pretty much everything I had taught. So then the first thing I did is I went back to the foundational documents of the Southern Baptist Convention, the starting of the denomination I was in. And I read those, and they were in harmony with what I now believed. But then I took the statement of faith of our church, and they were almost exactly opposite of the foundation doctrines of the church. And that began, the light went off, and I actually went to my pastor, and I asked him, how can we now believe the opposite of what the founders of the Southern Baptist Convention believed. And he explained it away. He never did. He never did answer. I ended up leaving the church. I had become in conflict with all of them, and I'm not the kind of person that I run in today who feels like he has to go tackle everybody and make them believe what he believes. I just felt like if people didn't want to talk about it, or if they didn't have the ability because of a lack of knowledge, then that was God's business to fix them and not mine. And I began a real intensive study of logic too, although I had studied it in college and studied it since then. I started studying logic, read Isaac Watts' book on logic. And the lights really came on as far as my understanding, ability to read the Bible and understand what was going on, and understanding it all in a continuum, the history of the church, the history of man. And I started traveling a little and teaching and explaining these things in light of things that were going on in the world. And the more that happened, the more I came to an understanding that not only was our Christian, Western Christianity wrong and apostate in my mind, but that the world culture had followed that, and that culture was also apostate. And so that's when I started studying about and learning about agrarianism. We moved to a small farm, and those things became incorporated into my belief system too, that this was God's intention for us. And so I'm going to talk more about that in the coming videos. But I just wanted to kind of explain how I got from there. And I have a natural distrust, and I apologize if this impacts on anybody that's listening to this. I have a natural distrust, I don't want to call it a distrust, skepticism of anybody who is just in the belief system they were born into. Maybe you were born in, and I hope that's true of my children. But I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that maybe they have not gone through this path of study and research and prayer and harmonization and logic and reason and and those things, and perhaps people have come to believe things. And at the same time, I met so many people who came from more abusive type of religious cults and those type of things, and saw, they seemed to be chasing after something that told them they were okay, something that told them that they were all right, something that didn't condemn them. And so, and the biggest problem was that we're living in an age of illogic, of unreason. Give you an example. After my last video, and I hope if you've watched this video this far, you watched my last video. A guy messaged me on YouTube after he watched that video, and his argument went like this. It's opened up with, of course, he assumes that I'm ignorant of everything, which is what you do when you don't know when you don't know anything. You assume, because you don't know anything, what you know is everything, and everybody else is less than you, right? So he begins talking down to me, and he starts talking to me about Manichaeanism, which I've studied in depth and could teach a class on it, which was an ancient Gnostic heresy of dualism. And he said his logic was this: Manichaeanism is Gnostic and taught about dualism. And Augustine, there's a huge leap because he doesn't connect any of the threads between Augustine and Manichaeanism. He just states Augustine had some Manichaean tendencies and had come out of Manichaeanism. And then his next leap was John Calvin quoted Augustine 30-some times. Therefore, the nickname of Calvinism, which doesn't exist, is Manichaeanism. And that's 4 levels of logic fallacy. And even more fallacies on top of that, because there's no, just because there's an ancient heresy, let's say we'll call it Boboism, and Boboism teaches this craziness, but Boboists also believe that you should feed and take care of and love and nurture your children. You don't get to come back later on and say, okay, Guy, we'll call him Fred, centuries later, who was a Boboist but converted away from Boboism to Christianity, also taught that you have to feed and take care of and nurture and love your children. And then later on, another guy quotes that guy after his conversion, therefore, if you feed and love and care for and take care and nurture your children, that is this ancient heresy of Boboism. So the fallacies are so intense. And the guy doesn't even know what Manichaeanism is. And I just delete those. And because one thing I've learned, comment dwellers, the people who live their life, they don't have an outward expression of their faith other than to either spread error or because of their own lack of knowledge and lack of experience or lack of understanding, they become comment dwellers. Those people are generally, in my experience, I've been doing this for 20 years, never change their mind when you challenge their fallacies. And you can chase them around. It's like trying to nail Jello into the wall. You can chase them. It's going back to my first video. Comment dwellers are the worst. The people that I've felt that I can communicate with are people that maybe send me an email and they start off with an understanding that perhaps they're in error, perhaps I'm in error. They would like to understand, and then they have specific things that they can connect one thing to another thing, and they want an answer to that, much as I did when I went into the scriptures. I said, okay, I'm looking for a solution to the tension between these two seem to be contradictory ideas or contradictory statements. And this is intelligence and this is reason. What is unreasonable, I was talking with a brother today in fellowship, and he has a small boy, baby, and the baby's scooting along the floor, and he picks things up and puts them in his mouth. And humans are really one of the only creatures that test whether something is safe or poisonous or deadly by sticking it in their mouth, which shows that we need to be watched over. And but that's true of people that call themselves Christians too. They imbibe things without critical skepticism. They don't test these things to see if they're true. And so this guy, and he may be a perfectly fine guy, he's ignorant as the day is long, but he obviously read some book. It was probably David Cloud or Dave Hunt or one of those guys whose opinions have been absolutely destroyed by truth for a very long time. And those guys cast off objections with these empty, illogical trains that dumb people pick up and go, oh, okay, well, that explains that, rather than any type of in-depth examination. All right, so this thing's getting kind of long, so this is video 2 of how I got where I am. If you've watched this far, I appreciate it. If not, that's fine too. I think I've got a couple more parts we'll get to when the time comes. I want to talk more about how I got into agrarianism and how I got into the plain lifestyle. And if you do in the meantime have questions for me, you can always feel free to email me, bunker2k@hotmail.com. My website, michaelbunker.com. And you can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/offgrid. All right, I'll talk to y'all soon. Thank you.